In this lecture, we will look into other concepts in OpenShift, such as builds and image streams. However, before we proceed, it is expected to know what Docker is, what a Docker image is, and how to build a Docker image given the application. We have already covered this in the previous prerequisite lecture. In a previous section, we discussed about projects and how to create a project in OpenShift. So, the next step is to add an application into the project. But where is the application, and how do I add it to my project? OpenShift has built-in integration to source code management tools hosted internally or externally, such as GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, etc. So you must have your application code uploaded to a source code repository in order to deploy it on OpenShift. When you try to add the application to a project in OpenShift, specify the location of the source code repository in the Git repository field. In this case, we are using a sample application hosted on a GitHub code repository. When you add an application to a project, OpenShift automatically creates a build job for the application using the URL of the code repository specified in the previous step. When run, the build downloads a copy of the code from the code repository and builds the code using a predefined build configuration into a Docker image. The Docker image is then pushed to the built-in Docker registry. We will talk about build in more detail in a few minutes. But before that, let's take a quick look at another object that is created automatically when an application is added to a project. Along with creating a build, OpenShift also creates a deployment automatically. On a successful build, the deployment deploys the application using the image from the internal Docker registry to the built-in Kubernetes cluster, making the application available to the end users. Deployments in OpenShift are similar to the concept of deployments in Kubernetes if you are familiar with it. In fact, we discussed it during a prerequisite section on Kubernetes. But they are really not the same. By default, OpenShift creates a deployment using a deployment config object, which is part of the OpenShift API for Kubernetes, as opposed to the deployment object in Kubernetes, which is part of the Kubernetes native API. We will discuss more about deployments in the upcoming lectures. To summarize, when we add an application to a project, OpenShift automatically creates a build and triggers it. It downloads the source code, builds the Docker image, pushes it to the Docker registry, and creates a deployment to deploy the application onto the built-in Kubernetes cluster. All of these are built-in functionality within OpenShift and does not require us to perform any additional configuration, other than specifying the link to the code repository where the application code is hosted. Let's go through a demo on adding an application to the OpenShift project and viewing it.